On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Amy Slater. I'm your moderator for this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest, David Hoffman. David is the President Emeritus and founder of Internews, a global nonprofit organization that fosters independent media and access to information worldwide. In addition, David was a founder of and serves as Chairman Emeritus of the Global Forum for Media Development, a cross-sector initiative of more than 500 leading media assistance organizations from over 100 countries. Hoffman has written widely about media and democracy, the internet, and the importance of supporting pluralistic local media around the world. His articles have appeared in many renowned periodicals, and he has testified before the U.S. House and Senate committees on issue of press freedom and access to information. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Hoffman.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Boy, it's good to see some old friends here who I haven't seen, some of whom I haven't seen in 20, 30 years. Thank you all for coming tonight. First, a disclaimer. I'm not a journalist. I'm actually, I guess, a media activist. But I love journalism and journalists, and like all of you probably here today. I don't know if any of you saw the debate in the New York Times 2 months ago between Bill Keller and Glenn Greenwald. Keller is the longtime venerable editor of the New York Times, and Greenwald, of course, is the man working for The Guardian who published most of the Snowden revelations. Basically, Greenwald was attacking Keller and attacking the New York Times on two levels. One, he didn't like the fact that the American style of journalism, epitomized by the New York Times, tries to hide the political orientation of the person, of the journalist. So in the United States, it's not considered proper journalism to express an opinion or express your political beliefs in an article. And in the British system, it's common to have your opinion shown. Greenwald was saying that the journalists of the New York Times were being, in a way, disingenuous by not revealing their political orientation. But more importantly, he was attacking the New York Times for being too close to the administration. And it's really worth Googling that. If you Google Keller and Greenwald, New York Times, you'll come up with this. It's a brilliant article on both sides of that debate. Personally, I must say I don't like it when I don't like the British style of journalism where they express their opinion, because I want to make my own opinion about these things. But I definitely can see Greenwald's point and agree with him in terms of how close the New York Times has been to various administrations. Ironically, right after that article came out, the public editor of the New York Times criticized her own newspaper for withholding, for over a year until after the election of George W. Bush, withholding the information about the second election, withholding the information about warrantless surveillance. But it raises the important point, I think, of the argument on both sides of this. Keller is actually brilliant in trying to defend the New York Times. The important point is to recognize the power and the impact that journalists have in this world, and a certain responsibility that then gives them. Let me just so you really understand the debate, let me just read you a sentence from each of them as how they describe journalism. Keller says, journalists should follow the facts, as a judge in court is supposed to set aside prejudices to follow the law and the evidence. It's kind of the scientific idea. Journalism shares with science the same ethos of objectivity. But Greenwald says, all journalism is a form of activism. Every journalistic choice necessarily embraces highly subjective assumptions, cultural, political, or nationalistic, and serves the interests of one faction or another. I think that's undoubtedly true. And I think journalists need to recognize that when they choose what subjects to look at, no matter how objective they're going to be, their choice of what they choose to put on the front page is very important. In a way, they're kind of like the shamans or the priests of today. Look at the responsibility of journalists. One way to look at it is look at what just happened in Kenya. In 2007, 2008, there was the election violence. Over 1,000 people were killed there. It was largely fanned by vernacular media, ethnic language media on radio until they closed off the radio because of it. And then everybody started using social media, which made things even worse, actually. The journalists, even the ones who actually fanned the flames of violence, came together later. They felt really ashamed of what had happened and their role in it. And they spent the next few years doing a lot of self-evaluation and taking a lot of workshops on how to report on the news without inflaming violence. And I think most critics and most analysts of Kenyan politics today will say that it's because of the changed role in the media that you didn't have violence this time around in the last elections. So I just got back. I was just speaking at the Arab Free Press Forum in Tunis. I just got back yesterday. I woke up this morning at 2 o'clock with intense jet lag. I mean, intense wakefulness. I have intense jet lag right now. And with the question, I woke up with this idea, what is the crux of the problem? And then I went, well, wait, what problem? This is kind of a diversion from my talk, but I'll get back to journalists in a second. It had to do with our species. What is the problem with our species? We don't have predators, except maybe microscopic ones. We don't really have predators in the normal sense. So we have fought with each other in wars and violence and all kinds of things. And we've been very hostile to the environment which sustains us. We're kind of a strange species. But I think that we need to see the way in which we are humanizing our planet. There's, I come from Arcata, Humboldt State University is there. There was a professor there who wrote a rather obscure book called The Human Planet. It's worth trying to find. I think you could only find it on Google Books now. His name was Conrad Bonifazi. It was a brilliant book in which he says, basically, we are transforming our planet in our own image. We are, in a sense, like God for our planet, and it reflects us. And that's for good and for bad. I mean, humans, besides all the violence that we create among each other, we also create sublime works of art and music. And so we're capable of all those things. And I believe, and the reason I tie this in now to journalists, is that responsibility that journalists have really will set, in many ways, the direction of our species in how we act. Because we're constantly trying to tackle our own problems. And I think the main humanizing force, the main thing that distinguishes human beings is our love of freedom. We all love freedom. No matter what political system somebody lives in, I've traveled all over the world, I've never yet found a human being that doesn't want freedom, at least for themselves, maybe not for others, but they want freedom. Everybody wants freedom for themselves. So I think through science, basically through information and education, we can transform our planet. And in that endeavor, as we transform it, as we get better at dealing with our environment and with each other and learn how to overcome our differences, the one most important thing to getting over the destructive parts of our nature and transforming our world in an image of ourselves that is good is going to be information. Without information, we can't tackle those problems. So let me say why I wrote this book, Citizens Rising, Independent Journalism and the Spread of Democracy. Really for two reasons. One is personal and one's political. Personally, I love to tell stories. I love reading The New Yorker. I love reading the personal stories behind the news. They're always so much more interesting. And I have had the good fortune of knowing some really remarkable people who have played transformative roles in their society. And politically, the reason that I wrote the book is that I was national director for the peace movement in 1979, 1980, when there was the threat of nuclear war, when missiles from Russian submarines could reach our coast in 6 minutes, and there was this great threat of nuclear war. And what we realized, those of us who were active in the anti-nuclear war movement, what we realized then was that the only force that was powerful enough to meet the challenge that these militaries posed to each other was media. Media is the most powerful force for social change the world has ever known. And yet, and I have spent 32 years dealing with this issue, and yet historians and policymakers don't recognize it. You can read a history book about the major political events of our lifetimes. You'll rarely see any mention of the role of media and media activists. And so, because right after this survival summer, it was called, when we were doing the 1980 movement against nuclear weapons. Right after that, we formed an organization called Internews, which is headquartered here in San Francisco, 3220 Sacramento Street. And Internews started by using media to create a dialogue between the Soviet Union and the United States at the height of the Cold War. So there were no student exchanges, no scientific exchanges back then, no cultural exchanges. We were enemies poised to wipe out humanity. It was kind of an insane, literally insane period of mutually assured destruction and all that. We began doing what were then called space bridges, satellite television exchanges that allowed Soviet and American audiences to talk to each other, astronauts and cosmonauts, veterans of World War II. Eventually, I produced a series called Capital to Capital, which, with ABC News, that got the leaders of the Supreme Soviet and the leaders of the US Congress to talk to each other in really the first public dialogues we had, and they were broadcast to 200 million people. Internews has gone on, by the way, to work in over 90 countries, and we've trained 150,000 journalists and media professionals. And I say all this because my own interests have been to get the policymakers to recognize that it's much better to train 150,000 journalists than it is to pour this year $700 million into foreign broadcasting. So we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on an Arab language satellite television channel that is the joke of the Arab-speaking world. It would be far more effective to develop independent media, which Internews and 1,000 other organizations now are doing. Media is important. Let me just quickly say, because I really want to spend as much time as I can with you in dialogue and questions and answers. That's always the most interesting part, I think, Amy. And if you want to change cultural attitudes, it's relatively easy to change the political situation. You can have big demonstrations that overthrow the government and change politics. To change cultural mores, it's much harder. The role of women, attitudes about sexuality, all sorts of things that are ingrained in a culture of thousands of years. It's very hard to change. Media is the only possible way, I think, to bring those changes about, especially when you were dealing with things like the role of women. Media is essential in good governance. We can talk about multi-party elections all we want, but if you don't have multi-channels to go with multi-parties, you're not going to have a democracy. But I just want to spend a moment, though, on one aspect that's perhaps a little bit more dramatic, which has to do with the role of media for people that are living under oppressive dictatorships, oppressive and corrupt authoritarian governments. Media is absolutely essential. If you look at these demonstrations that are happening in Chile and Brazil and Thailand and Ukraine and the Arab Spring, obviously, they're almost all led by media activists. And I would talk a second about what I call the dictator's dilemma. Let me give you three examples perhaps, 4 examples. When you have a corrupt and authoritarian government, whether it's a full dictatorship or a so-called liberal dictatorship, they face this dilemma in which they know, let's take Edward Shevardnadze, who was a relatively liberal authoritarian leader in Georgia. He knew, and most dictators know, that if they want to grow their economies and get the benefit of globalization, they need to open up their media. But then the dilemma is, if they do that, they might get overthrown. So Shevardnadze, to his credit, allowed the establishment of independent commercial television channels. But when the most popular of these, Rustavi II, which had over 50% of the market, when they broadcast exposés, investigative journalistic reports of the highest caliber about corruption inside the government, the Ministry of the Interior sent, their 30 guys with ski masks on to close down the station. And a guy named Hiroshi Kishmashvili had the good sense to turn his cameras on live. So 10,000 people came and surrounded the station, marched on the parliament, and Shevardnadze had to dissolve the government. A year later, there were presidential elections, and Hiroshi spent $150,000 of his own money, and which was matched by George Soros, and they got election monitors to do exit polling. And when the official results came in on the news, on the sidebar, they had the official government results, and on the bottom, they scrolled the results coming in from all of the exit polls, which were absolutely the opposite of what the government was reporting. And tens of thousands of people then streamed into Tbilisi, all of which, by the way, was shown live on television, and it led to what was called then the Rose Revolution and the beginning of the color revolutions. Same thing happened in Pakistan. General Musharraf, again to his credit, but for all the wrong reasons actually, he liberalized the media. He allowed the establishment of independent commercial television and radio stations. The reason was that before he took power, he led the disastrous invasion of Kargil, and the Pakistan state media only played martial music, basically, and everybody who wanted to see the news of what was happening tuned into Indian cable that they were able to receive on cable there. They had some illegal cable connections. So basically everybody was getting their news from the enemy. And he knew he couldn't transform that ridiculous bureaucracy of Pakistan state television, which had like 50,000 employees or something. So he liberalized the media. And to this day, it's one of the most vibrant medias in the world now. When Musharraf tried to fire, or did fire, the head of the Supreme Court, he humiliated him. For 5 hours, he berated him. He had his generals there, all in their uniforms, and for 5 hours, they berated this guy, the Chief Justice, Chaudhry. And it was captured on television, which then ignited this whole jurist movement, which when that turned into a riot in in Islamabad, the police stormed into GOTV, the major television network's studios, fired tear gas in there. And again, he learned from what Hiroshi had done. He turned his cameras on live, which ignited the entire revolution against Musharraf. So Musharraf, in a sense, started his own overthrow by liberalizing the media. And again, the same thing happened in Tunisia and Egypt. In Tunisia, a poor fruit vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, self-immolated after being humiliated and mistreated by a policewoman. A video was on YouTube and Facebook, was picked up by the Mubashir Arab language network of Al Jazeera, broadcast through the region, igniting the Arab Spring. In Egypt, a young man, Khalid Said, was beaten to death by police in Alexandria. A Facebook page was created called We Are All Khalid Said. They called for people to march on Tahrir Square, and you know the rest. I think what's interesting is in most of these cases, and I could cite many more, one individual's humiliation, the Chief Justice being berated in Pakistan, the fruit vendor Bouazizi, who was mistreated in Tunisia, and the young man who was beaten to death by police in Alexandria. One person's humiliation captured by the media can ignite the collective shame of a country and unleash revolutionary rage. Shame is a very important factor in human history that's often ignored. China is an interesting example. If you read the press, most of the press in the West talks about they take two sides. One is the idea that a social media will create a revolution in China. The other argument is there's just so much censorship, 60,000 censors and whatnot, that people think that there'll never be any revolution. But in fact, the revolution's already happened in China. Tens of millions of blogs, tens of millions of text messages. Charitable organizations have proliferated online. Labor strikes are happening that are organized through social media. People are able to express themselves in a way that, and reach an audience in a way that it would have been inconceivable 10 years ago. So there is a revolution happening within cyberspace in China. Whether or not it happens in real space, we'll have to see. But right now, there is what we could call a network civil society that's happening online in China. China could go the way of Burma to get out of the dictator's dilemma. Burma has remarkably, almost inconceivably, it has completely freed its media. It's amazing what they've done. And they've gotten out of the dictator's dilemma basically by instituting a whole range of democratic reforms. Or China could go the way of Musharraf. And as long as the economy keeps doing well, I don't think there's any real chance in either China or Saudi Arabia of the kind of demonstrations that we've seen overthrowing governments in other parts of the world. But should the economy turn sour, there is a very vital, well-connected, well-developed civil society among netizens in China. So I'm going to stop there if I can, Amy, and
Yes, of course.
I think we'll have more fun with questions.
All right. Well, thank you, David. And I'm actually going to exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask you the first question, which is
Well, you're
Edward...
a lawyer. This could be trouble.
I'm a recovered lawyer. Is Edward Snowden a citizen journalist?
No, he's not a journalist. It's like the relationship between Julian Assange and what's her name, Manning. Chelsea, thank you, Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning was leaked information the same way that Edward Snowden's leaking information. It's up to journalists like Glenn Greenwald or the New York Times or others to who are, I think, are journalists, and there certainly are many citizen journalists. I doubt that Snowden would call himself a journalist. He's really a provider of information.
Well, where do you think he fits into your sort of schema of citizen journalism?
Well, I mean, you know, when I was in Tunis, this Arab Free Press Forum was organized by the World Association of Newspapers, and it was all what we could call old media people there. Actually, they were actually literally old. They were as old as I was, and they're very defensive about citizen journalism. Very defensive. For obvious reasons, they have a lot invested in their jobs as trained journalists. In my mind, it doesn't matter whether somebody is a graduate of the UC Berkeley School of Journalism or if they're a farmer in Somalia. If they tell the facts the way they are, and they do it in a way that is captivating, then it's good journalism. It doesn't matter whether they have a degree or not. And in terms of Snowden and all that, I think they have righted a lot of wrongs that, and here I think Greenwald is correct in his criticism of the New York Times. There is obviously national security interests that need to be protected by journalists. When you know a story, you have information, but releasing that information could cause violence or could jeopardize the national security of your country. It's a tough call whether you publish that or not. But investigative journalism practically disappeared from the United States. And now it's roaring back, I think, because of people like Snowden and Julian Assange or Manning and others who, you know, are giving this. I think there's a downside to it, obviously. But I think the more information we have, the more transparency we have, I think the better decisions we'll make as citizens.
Thank you. All right, I will now move on to some of your questions. First one being, with the line between journalism and politics obscured, how can we ensure nonpartisan news reporting, especially in developing countries or countries that are faced with political upheaval?
Well, number one, the most important way to guarantee that there's going to be what we would call Western-style objective journalism is to have pluralism, to have many sources of news. I think it's best to let the consumer of news determine what's good news and what's not good news. I remember telling someone about in Afghanistan, they were wondering why the Voice of America, despite $20 million a year or something invested in them, had almost an unmeasurable audience, less than 1% of the audience, compared to all kinds of other media outlets that did very, very well. And what my response was that these people have had 70 years of studying propaganda. They're exquisitely sensitive to propaganda. And so they can tell the difference between good news and bad news. When an experimental television program, I write about it in this book, television news program called Vzglad, started in Russia, organized by a man named Edward Sagalayev, who is one of the citizen activists that I highlight in this book. When Vzglad went on the air at midnight, it was kind of a youth-oriented news program, they got 90% of the audience. They completely obliterated Soviet state television's audience, which was pure propaganda. People know, it's like the definition, you're a lawyer, I don't know the case, you could probably cite it, but the case of the Supreme Court ruling on pornography, you know it when you see it. Well, you know good journalism when you see it too.
All right, sort of following up on that, are there guidelines journalists can follow to help promote peace and still report the whole truth?
It's a good question. It's actually being debated now. There's a big debate going on about that right now. I think the answer is yes. again, I go back to my statement that I think that journalists are like today's shamans or today's priests. They have the possibility and therefore the responsibility to report in a way that is going to advance humanity, humanity's impact on the world. So there are obvious questions of when you have a political axe to grind, big questions, and we could spend many hours debating this. But I think overall, the overemphasis, for example, on violence, on negative news, does not help our world very much. It's very important. But I think that we often, in our search for entertainment, we often miss important stories that could contribute to peace. And especially those stories that, in a sense, expose our enemies to ourselves. How many of you have gone to Iran, for example, have traveled to Iran? Oh, you should. It's fantastic. It's an amazing culture. And we hardly know them at all. So I think, journalists could do a lot more to kind of go behind the veil of these cliches about each other. And I think that's good news. I think there are important stories that are not being covered that, if they were covered well, would contribute to a more peaceful and a more enlightened world, which is what the role of journalists is. Journalists are supposed to enlighten us.
Moving on a little bit here, how can independent media gain the traction to challenge the appeal of the 24-hour cable news cycle? And how does one encourage independent journalists to stay motivated when financial compensation and money flow is not there?
Yeah, this is a big problem. Some of the, we have all these citizen journalists around the world, probably hundreds of thousands of them at this point, who are largely uncompensated. And not only are they being ripped off, but then the institutional media is losing tons of money because of this. So the economic model for journalism is changing. Personally, I'm very much in favor of the disintermediation of media. It's just like, I want a direct line to God. I don't want to have to go through a priest to get to God. I don't want to have to go through a journalist to get to, to have them tell me what the story means. And so I'm very much in favor both of citizen journalism, firsthand reports by people, and I think that, I don't think it's a question of how do they gain traction. They've gained traction. The fact is that traditional journalism has been enriched by social journalism. Take that Tunisia example I was giving you before. There were no foreign journalists in Tunisia. There were 10 foreign journalists in Rwanda during the genocide. We have no more foreign bureaus. So there was no way that the traditional media could cover what was happening in Tunisia, except for these citizen journalists who had prepared for 8 years for that moment. They were ready when it happened. It's the untold story of Tunisia that it was basically led by a group of citizen journalists in an organization called Nawat. It was part of Global Voices. If those of you, Global Voices is an amazing network of citizen journalists around the world that's translated into English. It's worth going to sometime. But they were ready. They prepared for it. And when it happened, they not only could use social media to mobilize people to get into the streets, but they were very effective in getting the social media, in collating the social media that came in and all the video and films, and get that out to the international media to keep the spotlight on. And they were really, I just spent 4 hours with Sami Ben Garbia, who was really in many ways the architect of the whole Arab Spring. And anyway, sorry.
We have a couple questions here actually about Al Jazeera. I'm going to sort of combine them. Your thoughts about Al Jazeera having purchased current TV, and to what extent do you think it's challenging the status quo in the U.S. media market?
Well, Al Jazeera is practically the only television news I watch, so I'm somewhat prejudiced by it. I think Al Jazeera English has been fantastic. I think the only thing close to them is the BBC. But American television news is almost not, in my mind, hardly worth watching anymore. And so I generally have liked Al Jazeera English. I'm told by people who watch Al Jazeera Arabic that it's far more Islamic and Islamist and very, sometimes very pro-jihadist than the English version is. But all I know is that what I see, their coverage, their long-form coverage particularly, is great. And I think they're raising the bar for television news, and it's going to be hard. You may have noticed that CNN is even dropping their coverage of breaking news. There needs to be more of this. You know, what's interesting is when Al Jazeera was not the first, Mideast Broadcasting Corporation was the first Arab language satellite. It was revolutionary. If you lived in any Arab-speaking country, you could not really get any news about your own country. There'd be plenty of criticisms of the other Arab countries. So if you were in Syria, you could get criticism all day about Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, but you never get any real information about your own country. And that was the same in each country. Along came the Mideast Broadcasting Corporation, and all of a sudden, there is coverage of everybody's country, including your own. And now, today, to give you some idea of how important this has been, there are now more than 800 Arab language satellites orbiting the Earth right now.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing they don't all collide with each other. It's going to be like Gravity. How many of you guys have seen Gravity, I guess? Yeah.
All right. I guess why does our media, I would think by this, the questioner means sort of the mainstream media, dismiss as marginal the same kinds of stories that sparked revolutions in Egypt, Yugoslavia, China, etc., giving a couple of examples, but I'll just let you.
But I think I misheard you. Why did they?
Dismiss as marginal the same kinds of stories that sparked revolutions in Egypt, Yugoslavia, China.
I don't know. You know, I don't know why we're so parochial in this country. It's sort of stunning to me, and I wish I knew. They obviously think the audience isn't interested in that. I think they're making a mistake. I think the audience would be more interested in covering things. I mean, it's always embarrassing for me to travel around the world, and wherever I go, you know, taxi drivers will inevitably know the name of my congressman. And I don't know the name of their president. I mean, it's terrible. But the world is much more knowledgeable about us than we are about them. And that American parochialism has gotten us and the world into a lot of trouble.
I think part of what you write about is how broadly access to media has grown with smartphones and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. One of the questions is: are there people who are so poor that who don't have access to the tools of citizen journalism being neglected in this new media world?
Yeah, you've all heard of the digital divide. I think that's largely disappeared now. There is what I call information poverty in the world that is surprising. The UNICEF estimates there are 400 million children in the world who don't get any information in their own language. That's pretty stunning. But I think cell phones, particularly more than the internet, are changing all that. So it's a total revolution when you go from 20% of the world 10 years ago connected basically to media, and all of a sudden now almost everybody in the world every single person in the world has the ability to call anybody else in the world. With this cell phone, I reach 2 million people when I'm whipping up a lather for my book. I mean, it's amazing the power that has, and we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's just starting. These revolutions, these mass demonstrations that are happening in Ukraine, Thailand, Chile, and wherever are just the beginning of the democratization of media and the effect it's going to have on governance. People are sick and tired of corruption. They're sick and tired of governments that aren't responsive to them. And now they have that information. So I think the answer is that, in fact, there are very few people left in the world. There's still some. There's a large number. 2/3 of the world is still not connected to the internet. But the expansion of cell phone connectivity is simply startling. Wherever you go, it's amazing. And by the way, they have actually can get 4 bars everywhere as compared to this country, which seems like the most underdeveloped country in the world. I mean, we invent these things and then we don't follow through with them. It's amazing.
Yeah, I've had really good conversations on my cell phone in Bhutan that I couldn't have in Berkeley. So.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
Yeah.
I was in Tiger Leaping Gorge in China, which is like the Grand Canyon. At the bottom of Tiger Leaping Gorge, I had 4 bars. And in my downtown Arcata where I live, I'm lucky if I can get a signal.
Yeah,
Ridiculous.
Absolutely. So this question, I think, gets to maybe sort of one of the cruxes, I guess, is that the plural of crux?
Yeah.
Of what may concern people about citizen journalists, which is, how do you do fact-checking?
You don't. I mean, unfortunately, that is a problem, and there are various websites now that are trying to, that you can go to, but I think most people are not going to bother, and that's one of the dangers, of course, is misinformation through social media. Again, I think pluralism is the best way to deal with the problem. The danger that I see in the social media space is one that Eli Pariser I don't know if you've had Eli here to speak, but you should. He's one of the, I've never met him personally, but he's the man who founded MoveOn.org, and he wrote a very important book called The Filter Bubble. And what he says is that the structure of the new media is, and online communities in general, is that it's moving us to the extremes. It's moving us to only be with the people who like us on Facebook. People who buy this book like this book. So we're only going toward the things and the people we like. I want to create an unFacebook that has dislikes. I want to know who dislikes me so that I can talk to them, because we're losing the commons. And that concerns me probably more than any other of the aspects of the dangers, the obvious dangers of fact-checking and other things like that come with the democratization of the media. De Tocqueville, it's the same thing de Tocqueville saw with the question of democracy. Would it be ruled by the mob? Would democracy lead to the mob? Well, it hasn't. And I don't think social media is going to lead to mob rule either, despite the Tea Party, which uses social media very effectively, by the way.
So does that mean that journalism is sort of extinct?
I think in some ways it does to a degree. I mean, I think the entire economic model of media is changing. But the counter-argument to that is that I've read this statistic, I didn't do my fact-checking, so I can't say for sure, but I've read that 90% of the content from citizen journalism and social media originated with old media. So traditional media, they may not be making as much money producing that news, but they continue to be the main source of news.
So this question refers back to your comments on British journalism being not having sort of the cult of partisanship that U.S. journalism has. Would you say that outlets like Fox News are British in style?
Yes, but worse.
Is that because of Murdoch? And following up, what is the most neutral news outlet in the U.S.?
NPR. The and the New York Times. I mean, I was criticizing the New York Times, but I still think they're probably the best newspaper in the world today. The I don't know.
Is that you don't know the most neutral news outlet?
Well, I
No,
said
no, that
NPR and New York
okay.
Times. I've forgotten the rest
Oh,
of the
I'm
question.
sorry. Would you say outlets like Fox News are British
Oh,
in
yeah, I see.
style? And is that Murdoch's doing?
Yeah, it's really I get sad from watching. You know, when I really only watch American television news when I'm in hotels, and I'm always shocked by how bad it is. And I'm not sure what that means, except that I think they'll disappear because of it. I think they're making a mistake with that. I think Al Jazeera, to go back to that other question, Al Jazeera America is going to really cut into the audience share because it's a better news channel. So I think there's room for competition, and I think everybody's chasing after the Fox News model, and MSNBC did, and now CNN is, and I just think we're going in the wrong direction. But again, I don't watch American news, so I'm not the right person to comment on that, I guess.
It seems like an incredible dichotomy between sort of partisan journalism like Fox News or MSNBC or and then sort of non-journalism, whatever is replacing journalism, being the sort of the citizens provided. It just seems like it makes it incredibly difficult to decide what you're going to believe.
Yes, but despite all the criticisms of the media, the question I keep asking people is, are you better informed? Are you better informed than you were 10 years ago? Do you have better sources of information? And I think the answer is invariably yes. It definitely is in China. I would say it is even in the United States, even though we've seen a decline in especially television news. But we can be discerning, and we can find good news. When something happens in any country in the world, I can go, there's usually a good English language newspaper online from that country. You can get incredible amounts of information in English. And now you can actually get everything translated. So you actually can, if you're interested in the news, you can get really good information. The problem is that we each own, it's that Eli Pariser, the filter bubble thing, we each tend to kind of choose, we get to choose our news. It's not Walter Cronkite anymore, where we're all in this. So I'm most worried about the loss of the commons because of the partisanship of the news. That worries me.
I'll just take a couple more questions, and if anybody has anything they'd still like to ask David, please feel free to jot it down, and we have a few more minutes. David Simon, creator of The Wire and former reporter for the Baltimore Sun, has argued that blogging and citizen journalism isn't journalism.
He's right.
What would you say to him?
He's absolutely right in some ways. I mean, my friend Aidan White, who ran the International Federation of Journalists, the union of all the journalists for the last 25 years, he makes the point that freedom of expression is not journalism. So, there are opinions, but that doesn't mean that they're not valuable, or it doesn't mean that citizens can't do good journalism. They do. Very often, some of the best journalism is being written by citizen journalism. But I think it's a mistake to mix up opinion blogs, which are, like I said, I'm not a journalist, but I write op-eds all the time. And I wouldn't, again, call myself a journalist because my op-ed was published in the Wall Street Journal. They're opinion pieces, and they're different, and they're valuable. But they need to be labeled. And the problem happens when opinion passes for factual reporting. So it's very important that we label these things, which is my gripe with English-style journalism. And there's great journalism in England. I mean, The Guardian is a fantastic newspaper. The Economist is a great magazine. There's some great journalism from there. But I want to make determinations myself.
All right, one last question then. Where is Glenn Greenwald now? And
He's in room 401. No,
I'm
Glenn,
not
you
quite sure
there?
what the.
No, where is he now? All I know
this
is
very moment,
he left The Guardian, and he is going to be heading up this Pierre Omidyar's $250 million investment in investigative journalism. I'm very anxious to see what comes of that. Omidyar is obviously an incredibly creative man. I actually think his foundation is maybe the best run foundation in America right now. So I'm really anxious to see what Jeff Bezos from Amazon is going to do with the Washington Post. I expect it's going to transform American journalism. I think we're going to see the golden age of journalism soon with these investments. It's going to be very interesting. But I want to thank all of you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for your questions. And just reminding you that David's book, Citizen Rising, is available right over there for sale.
Oh, and if anybody wants me to sign it,
And David's
very
happy to
happy to.
sign it. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.